This screencast is about what alternative birth control programs exist. Now, in the last lesson, we looked at China's one-child policy, but not every country goes down that line. And we're going to look at an alternative today, which is known as Transmigration, and that happened in Indonesia. Indonesia is a rapidly developing country in Southeast Asia. It comprises a group of 17,500 islands, known as an archipelago. Two of the largest being Sumatra, here, and Java, here. With a population of about 240 million, it's the fourth most populous country in the world. The population has grown at a rate of just over 1% per year, with the birth rate at 18.1 per thousand, that was in the year 2011, and the death rate at a very low 6.3 per thousand. Now, as you can tell, Indonesia, obviously with this big population, had to do something about it. And they use something called transmigration. Now, transmigration is a population policy that aims to move people from densely populated areas, so where there's lots of people, to sparsely populated areas where there's not many, and provide them with opportunities to improve the quality of their lives. Now, at the minute, population growth is slowing down in Indonesia, but back in the 1950s and 60s, it was growing really rapidly, and the islands of Java, Bali and Madura were in danger of becoming overpopulated. This occurs where there are not enough resources, so maybe not enough food or water or jobs or housing, to adequately support the number of people who are actually living there. So in 1969, an attempt was made to redistribute the population, put this transmigration in place and move people from those populated islands, such as Java, but to the more sparsely populated outer islands, such as Western Papua. Now, transmigration was a chance for people to escape the poverty of overcrowded urban slums in which they were living in these overcrowded islands, to become landowners elsewhere and earn money through farming. Now, between 1979 and 1984, at the height of the programme, when it was most popular, more than 2.5 million people were involved, and in total over 1 million people have resettled in Western Papua alone. Now, this scheme was financed by the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, and it continued through the 1980s, but recent financial difficulties and changes in the government have led to the policy being scaled down. So recent developments, in 2006, an estimated 20,000 families took advantage of the Transmigration programme, which was supported by the Department of Manpower and Transmigration. By 2010, there were about 250,000 families who wanted to move, but the government was only able to sponsor 10,000 of those families at a cost of $160.5 million US. So as you can see, it's a very expensive process. Now, in 2010, Mount Merapi, which is a volcano on Java, erupted, and the government offered to relocate tens of thousands of displaced people from Java to Kalimantan. By 2011, some 2,000 families had taken up the offer, encouraged by free transportation and the promise of 2 hectares of land and living costs for 6 months. So these people who were transmigrated were given incentives to go. So they were given the transport, they were taken to the actual island, but also promised a set amount of land and some money. So this photograph shows us a transmigration settlement. And as you can see, kind of these are your little buildings that people will live in, and then they own a particular amount of land. Now, obviously, transmigration has a number of effects, and it's probably eased overcrowding in some towns and cities, but it's also led to problems. So what were the economic effects? Rather than reducing poverty, critics suggest that transmigration has simply redistributed it. So instead of them all being in poverty on Java, they've made them go to another island where they've been in poverty there. Many new migrants lacked the necessary farming skills, so the idea was to put them onto this land to farm, but of course they weren't farmers, and therefore they couldn't make productive use of the new land, and some abandoned the new homes to become refugees. Settlements were often poorly planned, with few shops, roads and services such as water, sanitation and electricity. And as you can tell from this photograph, you've only got this kind of little track here, a little track there. There's not a great deal in that area other than the buildings and the farmland. Resettlement was extremely expensive. It cost $7,000 per family in the 1980s. The environmental effects. Transmigration has been blamed for accelerating the rate of deforestation in previously sparsely populated regions. As you can see in the background here, lots of trees and so on. People who want to farm the land have to get rid of those trees to farm it, and therefore causing deforestation. Poor land use practices such as overcultivation have led to issues of soil erosion. When you take the kind of vegetation off the top of the land, leaving that soil exposed, then the soil can get eroded away. Social effects. There were clashes that occurred between migrants and the indigenous populations. People already lived on those islands, and so the new people coming in, there was kind of a cultural clash there. In 2001, hundreds died when the local Dayaks and the transmigrant Maduris clashed. Traditional land rights were often ignored as land ownership was granted to the new settlers, so people who maybe thought they owned the land, once these new settlers came in, took over that land and again caused problems. There have been religious clashes between the Islamist migrants and the largely Christian local people, so religious clashes. There was political effects. Some critics have suggested that transmigration was encouraged by the government primarily to increase national security and control indigenous people in the outer islands. But despite the problems, the transmigration policy has resulted in the resettlement of an estimated 20 million people, mostly to Sumatra and Kalimantan. Whilst the population pressures have continued to increase in cities such as Jakarta on the island of Java, the situation would have been much worse if transmigration had not occurred. The final thing we're going to talk about in this screencast is something called industrialisation, which is another approach to coping with population pressures. Now, industrialisation is a process usually associated with the development of an economy, where an increasing proportion of people work in industries, so moving from farms maybe to kind of working in factories and the like. Now, for the future, birth control programs have led to a slowing down of population growth in Indonesia. The transmigration program will probably continue to decline. In its place, as Indonesia expands its programs of resource exploitation, for example, in things like minerals and timber, oil, palm and shrimp farming, and industrialisation, more and more poor people will migrate to the remoter islands looking for work. Since the 1990s, the government has encouraged industrialisation in those remoter islands through its eastward development policy. And by encouraging resource development and industrialisation, workers will naturally be attracted and go there. This can be considered another approach to coping with a rapidly growing population. Remember what we talked about in the demographic transition model, when people start working in factories and so on, and they're not working the land, they don't need as many children to help them do the farming, and therefore tend to have less children.